In Chapter 3 of the Pragmatic REST APIs course, we were talking about HateOS, but we also touched on API versioning, and I showed you how to implement support for URL versioning, and then we replaced that with support for media type versioning. We also implemented an API endpoint, the getHabit endpoint, which supports the version 2 of our API. But this isn't currently part of our documentation, and it's something that we are going to fix in this lesson. So let's jump into the code, and I'll show you what we have to do to document multiple API versions. Let's open up the dependency injection class and navigate to the add API services method. Inside of this method, we were configuring our API versioning services, and for this, we introduced a couple of external libraries. Now, I may have made a remark then that there is another library that we should consider, which is the API Versioning Explorer. So let's go ahead and introduce another NuGet package. I'm going to search for ASP Versioning, and the library that I'm looking for is ASP Versioning MVC API Explorer. Let me go ahead and install the latest version of this library, and this will allow me to introduce a call to add API Explorer. Now, I don't need to configure anything special here. This will be enough to describe the API versions that we support. However, we need to configure a few more options when setting up the Swagger Gen options. Now, I'm going to move this configuration outside of this delegate because it depends on an external service and into a configure options class. So let me define a new type inside of the settings folder that I will call configure Swagger Gen options. This will be a sealed class and is going to implement the iConfigure named options, and I'll specify the Swagger Gen options. In the named overload, I'm going to just call the non-named overload by saying configure and providing the options. And then I need to inject a service, the iAPI version description provider. Let's inject that inside of the constructor, and I want to use it inside of the configure method. So I can access the API version description provider to get the API version descriptions. I'm going to iterate over the API versions in a for each loop, and this will give me one API version description. For each description, I want to define an OpenAPI info object, and I want to introduce a Swagger document for the respective API version. Now I'm also going to define another type right below, and this is going to be another configure options type. So let's call this the configure Swagger UI options, and I'll implement the iConfigure named options and specify the Swagger UI options type. I'm also going to inject the iAPI version description provider, and inside of the configure method, I'm going to iterate over the descriptions and define a respective Swagger endpoint for each of the API versions. In the named overload, I'm going to call the non-named one, and I'm going to move this type into its own file. Now, because we are configuring the Swagger Gen options here, we can also move this piece of code into this configuration here because it's using the same type, and I can simplify the setup I have here to just calling add Swagger Gen. But I also need to configure the respective options. So I will say builder services configure options, and I'm going to specify the configure Swagger Gen options type, but also the Swagger UI options. So I'll say configure options, configure Swagger UI options, and this is going to invoke the respective configurations when these options types are resolved from dependency injection. A couple of more things I want to introduce inside of the configure Swagger Gen options is to enable custom schema IDs. This is just going to fix some issues that you might run into if you have generic types inside of your code. The second one is describing all parameters in camel case, and this is going to fix how the query parameters are described in the OpenAPI specification for the endpoints where we have classes encapsulating our query parameters. So now I should be able to start the application and see if API versioning is now properly documented. If you open up the Swagger UI, you'll probably notice a couple of differences. First, the OpenAPI document now has a different name that contains the API version, and this document belongs to version 1 of our API. You can also see this in the supported media types here, so this is good. Now if I click on the drop down here, we can take a look at the version 2 of our API. Here there is a different document, and inside of it there's only one endpoint definition, the get endpoint for retrieving a habit, which supports version 2, and you can see in the description of this OpenAPI document that the API version is 2.0. So now I can close this down, and all the API endpoints that we have available is just the single version 2 endpoint for retrieving a habit. Now you may notice that the DTO is missing. That's because I misconfigured the API documentation behind the scenes, but if I refresh finished this, and because I updated the endpoint documentation behind the scenes, now we're going to see additional documentation which contains the schemas. Now the important one is the habit with tags DTO version 2, which actually represents the type that we are returning from this endpoint. So our version 2 of the API is properly documented. Now let me go back to version 1. And I just want to confirm that in the endpoints where I have multiple query parameters encapsulated in an object, all are rendered as camel case, which you can see is the case. So the one setting that I introduced is also working. And this is how we can introduce proper API documentation for the multiple API versions that we have. Now the only thing that's missing is documenting authentication in our REST API, and that's what I'm going to do in the next lesson. The OpenAPI specification that we currently have for our API already documents the authentication-related response types. We're properly documenting 401 unauthorized and 403 forbidden responses, but we aren't communicating to our API clients which API endpoints require unauthenticated requests. But we aren't communicating to our API clients which type of authentication we need in order to be able to call our respective endpoint. This is something that we are going to cover in this lesson, and we're going to focus on the bearer token authentication, which is what our API supports, but the same also applies if you want to use any of the OAuth flows. This is something that is supported by the Swagger UI, which is an excellent feature. If I open up the settings folder and navigate to the configure SwaggerGen options class, I'll be able to call a method on the SwaggerGen options instance, which allows me to define a security definition. And this is how I can communicate with my API clients how my API is protected. Now I'm going to drop in the definition that I will be using. I'll give it a name called bearer, and I need to initialize a new OpenAPI security scheme. Let me format it like this to make it more scannable. In the OpenAPI security scheme, we're going to add a description, the name of the header that should be used for authentication. This is the default authorization header. What is the location of the value that should be provided for authentication? In our case, the location is going to be the header. The type of the security scheme can be one of the supported options, and we're going to be using API key, but the other two that are interesting are the OAuth and the OpenID connect types. You can use either of these if you are using an identity provider that supports OAuth, and then you can configure Swagger to properly authenticate using the correct security scheme. Now with just this setup in place, let's go ahead and start the application. And if I navigate to the Swagger UI, you will notice that there is now an authorized button here. This renders the security definition that we just configured, which is called bearer. It uses an API key, which is just going to be our access token. And here we are going to provide the value for this access token. Now let's say I authenticate by calling the login endpoint, specify my email and password. And if I send this request, I should get back an access token, and now I should be able to use this value and specify it in this input, click authorized, and now Swagger says that I'm logged in. So let's say I want to call the users/me endpoint, which should give me back the currently authenticated user. But if you take a look, we're getting back a 401 unauthorized response. Moreover, if you take a look at the request here, you might notice that the access token isn't present in the request that we sent to the API. So there's obviously a problem. And this is because we only configured the security definition. But another component that we need is a security requirement. And this is how I can specify a new OpenAPI security requirement. This accepts an OpenAPI security scheme, and here I'm going to reference the bearer scheme. So now I should be able to start the application again and properly authenticate with my API using the Swagger user interface. If you open up the Swagger UI after making this update, you might notice that there is now another new thing on the screen. Next to each of our API endpoints, we now have a lock icon, which represents that this endpoint requires authentication. So I saved the access token from my previous login attempt, and now I can specify it here by saying bearer and pasting in the token value, and I'm going to authorize and log in with the Swagger UI. And now let's try calling the same API endpoint as before. I'll say try it out, send the request, and we get a response back that represents the currently authenticated user. If I change the media type to be VND dev habit HateOS plus JSON and send the same request, we'll also get back our hypermedia links in the response. So you can see that content negotiation is also working as you might expect from the Swagger UI. And this concludes our short demo of documenting authentication support for our REST API. In the next lesson, I want to introduce you to some alternatives to the Swagger UI that could be very interesting if you are building a public-facing API and you really need proper API documentation that your API clients can use to figure out how to integrate with your API. So let's move on to the next lesson where I'll show you how to integrate Scalar.